There are moments in history that don't announce themselves. They arrive quietly, a phone call, a closed door, a short sentence spoken in a private room, and by the time the rest of the world hears about it, the decision has already been made. What happened inside the walls of the British royal family in those final weeks was exactly that kind of moment. Nobody was supposed to know, and yet somehow the truth always finds a way out. For years, people had been watching. Not just journalists with cameras lined up outside palace gates, not just commentators who made their living reading between the lines of royal statements, but ordinary people all over the world who had followed this story the way you follow something that feels personal, even when it isn't. Because that is what the British royal family had become. Not just a monarchy, not just a line of succession and ceremonial duty. It had become a story that people felt inside their own lives, about loyalty, about belonging, about what it means when the people you were born to love decide that you no longer fit. Harry and Meghan left in January 2020. That sentence sounds simple, but nothing about it was simple. The months before that departure had been full of meetings nobody acknowledged, conversations nobody recorded, and pain that both sides handled very badly. By the time the official announcement came that Prince Harry and his wife Meghan would step back from their roles as senior royals, the damage had already been done in ways that no press release could explain or undo. They moved to Canada first, then to California. Then they gave an interview to Oprah Winfrey that changed everything, or at least changed the way the public understood everything. And after that, there was no going back to the way things had been before. But people still hoped. That was the thing that never quite went away. Even among those who had strong opinions, even among those who had picked a side and defended it loudly on social media, there was a small, persistent hope that this would eventually resolve itself the way family things usually do. Slowly, painfully, but eventually. The children would grow older, the grandparents would soften, someone would reach out, someone would pick up the phone. And whatever had broken between Harry and his family would, over time, find some way to heal. That hope carried people through 2021, through 2022, through the death of Queen Elizabeth in September 2022, which had briefly seemed like a turning point. Harry had flown back. He had stood with his family. There had been photographs of him walking behind the coffin, and people had studied those photographs with an almost desperate attention, looking for something in the angle of his shoulders, in the direction of his eyes, in the way he and William stood relative to each other, searching for any sign that grief might do what years of negotiation had failed to do. But even grief has its limits. Even funerals end. Harry flew back to California. The distance remained. Through 2023, the relationship continued to deteriorate in public. Harry's memoir Spare came out in January of that year and landed like a stone thrown through a window. It was a book that named things, specific moments, specific words that had been spoken, and once those things were named, they could not be unnamed. The palace did not respond officially, but unofficially the tension was visible in every statement that was carefully worded to say almost nothing. In every royal engagement where Harry's name was conspicuously absent. In the way certain family members stopped being photographed together at events where, a few years earlier, they would have stood side by side without thinking about it. And still people hoped. Because the hope was not really about Harry and Meghan specifically. It was about something older and more basic, the belief that family bonds are stronger than pride. That time softens the sharpest edges, that even the worst falling-outs can eventually find their way to something that resembles peace. People wanted to believe that because they needed to believe it about their own lives, their own families, their own estrangements. The royal family had become a mirror, and what people were watching in that mirror was not really a palace drama. It was a question about whether reconciliation is ever truly possible once certain lines have been crossed. What nobody knew, not publicly, not yet, was that behind the scenes, the question had already been answered. Not with a dramatic confrontation, not with a shouted argument in some grand room. It had been answered the way most permanent decisions are made inside powerful families, quietly, carefully, and with the kind of finality that comes not from anger but from exhaustion. From the long, slow process of accepting that something is simply not going to change, no matter how many more chances it is given. Princess Anne had been the one who said it first, not publicly, not to any journalist or biographer, but to the people inside the family who needed to hear it said plainly by someone who had spent enough decades inside the institution to understand what its survival required. Anne had always been the practical one. The one who showed up, did the work, kept her opinions to herself in public, and saved her real thoughts for the rooms where real decisions were made. She was not known for sentimentality. She was known for clarity, and in those final weeks of discussion she had been very clear. The situation, as Anne saw it, was not complicated. It only appeared complicated because people kept hoping it was something other than what it was. Harry had made his choices. He had made them publicly, repeatedly, and in ways that could not be walked back without someone, either Harry or the institution, losing face in a way that neither could afford. The question was not whether Harry and Meghan could return to some version of royal life. The question was whether allowing that possibility to remain open was doing more harm than good. And Anne's answer to that question, delivered with the quiet authority of someone who had been watching this story longer than most, was no. It was not doing more good. It was doing harm, and the harm needed to stop. William had agreed. That agreement had not come easily or quickly. William loved his brother. Whatever else had happened between them, and a great deal had happened, that love was real, and it made every decision in this situation more complicated and more painful than it would have been between strangers. But William had also watched, over the years, what the ongoing uncertainty had done to the institution he was preparing to lead. Every time there was a story about a possible reconciliation, it created a cycle of expectation and disappointment that destabilized things in ways that were difficult to explain and even more difficult to manage. Every time Harry made a public statement that seemed to leave a door open, it reopened wounds that had barely begun to close. And William, who was already carrying the weight of knowing that he would one day be king, had reached a point where he understood that some doors needed to be permanently closed for the health of everything behind them. The conversation between Anne and William had happened in a private setting, in the kind of unhurried way that serious conversations require. There were no aides in the room, no advisors with notebooks. Just two members of the royal family who had, between them, enough experience of both love and duty to understand what was being asked of them. They did not agree on everything. They rarely did. But on this particular question, their thinking had converged into something that felt less like a decision and more like an acknowledgement. An acknowledgement that the situation had already resolved itself, in a direction that nobody had chosen, but everyone had, through years of smaller choices, collectively arrived at. The word that would eventually leak out, exile, was not a word that Anne or William used in their private conversations. It was a tabloid word, a dramatic word, a word designed to evoke dungeons and banishments and medieval punishments. The reality was quieter and in some ways more final than any dramatic exile could be. It was simply the recognition that Harry and Meghan had, through their own choices and through the family's choices in response, arrived at a place that was genuinely outside the institution. Not punished, not banished, just outside, and that the institution, in order to function, needed to stop pretending otherwise. The decision, if it could even be called a decision at this point, given how long it had been building, had implications that went far beyond Harry and Meghan themselves. There were the children, Archie and Lilibet, who were both old enough now to begin understanding, in the way children do, that their family situation was unusual. There was the question of titles and funding, and the various official arrangements that had never been fully resolved after the initial separation. There was the question of what would happen at future family events, coronations, weddings, funerals, and how the presence or absence of Harry and Meghan at those events would be handled and explained. All of these questions had been sitting in a kind of unresolved limbo for years. And the clarity that Anne and William had arrived at meant that those questions now had answers, even if those answers were difficult ones. The public would not learn about any of this immediately. That was not how things worked inside the institution. Information moved slowly, carefully, through layers of consideration about what could be said and what needed to remain unsaid. But the people who needed to know had been told, and the people who had been told had begun, quietly, to act on what they knew, making arrangements, adjusting plans, closing doors that had been left open for years in the hope that they might yet be walked through. Outside the palace walls, the world continued to speculate. Commentators offered their analyses. Social media churned through cycles of outrage and sympathy and everything in between. And somewhere in California, Harry and Meghan were living their lives, working on their projects, raising their children, navigating whatever private understanding they had reached about what their future looked like now. They had built something in America, Something real, even if it was smaller and quieter than what they had once imagined it would be. Whether they knew yet what had been decided, what had been in the language of institutions, finalized, was a question that only they could answer. But the decision had been made, and in the history of this family, a family that had survived abdications and scandals and wars and the slow transformation of the world around it, this was the kind of decision that, once made, did not get unmade. The door had not been slammed. It had been closed gently, with great care, by people who understood that some endings need to be treated with dignity even when they are painful. And it had been locked. The thing about institutions is that they have memories longer than any individual inside them. The British monarchy had survived things that, at the time they were happening, seemed like they might destroy it entirely. It had survived the abdication of King Edward VII, who had walked away from the throne for a woman the establishment could not accept. It had survived the years when the Queen's own children seemed determined to test the limits of what the public would tolerate. It had survived Diana. It had survived the cold, damaging silence that followed her death, when the family had retreated to Balmoral and the world had stood outside Buckingham Palace with flowers and anger and grief that had nowhere to go. Every time the institution had found a way to absorb the damage and continue. Not unchanged, it was always changed, but continuous, still standing, still functioning, still in some essential sense itself. The people inside that institution understood this history in a way that outsiders rarely did. They understood it not as a source of pride, necessarily, but as a kind of evidence. Evidence that the monarchy's survival had always depended not on being loved unconditionally, but on being understood on the public grasping, even when they were angry or disappointed, why the institution existed and what it was trying to do. When that understanding broke down, when the gap between what the monarchy represented and what it actually was became too wide, the institution was in danger, not of being overthrown exactly, but of becoming irrelevant. Of becoming a thing that people looked at and could not quite figure out the point of. That was the real danger, not revolution, irrelevance. William understood this. He had grown up inside the machinery of it, had watched his mother's relationship with that machinery destroy her in one way and make her immortal in another, and had spent his entire adult life trying to figure out how to be a person inside a role that had very little room for persons. He had done it, more or less successfully, by building a life that was structured enough to satisfy the institution and private enough to protect what was genuinely his. The marriage to Catherine had been part of that, a relationship that was real and loving, but also, in its public presentation, precisely calibrated to what the institution needed. The children, the engagements, the careful, controlled vulnerability that allowed people to feel close to him without actually being close to him. It was not cynical, it was survival. Harry had tried to do the same thing and had found that he could not. That was the truth underneath all the other truths, the one that got lost in the noise of the specific arguments and the specific accusations and the specific moments that people pointed to as the beginning of the end. Harry had tried for years to do what William had done, to find a way to be himself inside the role that had been assigned to him, and it had not worked. Not because he was weaker than William, or more self-indulgent, or less committed to the idea of service, but because the role itself was different. Because being the second son, the spare, the one who supported rather than led, required a particular kind of selflessness that Harry, as he grew older and more aware of what it was costing him, found he could not sustain. And Meghan's arrival had accelerated everything, had made visible what had been invisible, had brought into the open tensions that the family had been managing privately for years. The months after Harry and Meghan's initial departure had been characterized, inside the palace, by a kind of cautious waiting. There had been genuine hope in some quarters that the separation would be temporary, that once Harry had space and distance, he would find his way back to something that could work. The Queen had been part of that hope. She had cared about Harry, genuinely and without the complicated politics that characterized some of the other relationships in the family, and she had kept lines of communication open in ways that were not always publicly visible. Her death had removed that particular kind of bridge, the bridge that only a grandmother can build, the one that exists outside the formal hierarchies and political calculations of an institution and operates purely on the basis of love and history. After her death, things had changed in ways that were subtle but significant. Charles was king now, and whatever his private feelings about his younger son, and those feelings were complicated, layered with decades of their own history. He was also the head of an institution that he had spent his entire life waiting to lead. The responsibilities of that position had, from the moment of his accession, become his primary frame of reference, not because he didn't love Harry, but because the job required a certain kind of clarity about what the institution needed that didn't always leave room for what individuals inside it needed. And what the institution needed increasingly was resolution, not endless uncertainty, not the ongoing drain of a situation that had no clear trajectory. Resolution. Anne had seen this clearly from the beginning. She had watched the situation unfold with the particular clarity of someone who had never been central to it, who was close enough to the family to understand the dynamics, but far enough from the direct line of succession that she could observe without being immediately implicated in every development. She had strong opinions, which she had shared in the appropriate private settings without ever allowing them to leak into the public discourse. She was not someone who spoke to journalists. She was not someone who allowed her feelings about family matters to be visible in the way she carried herself at public engagements. She was, in the deepest sense, a professional, someone who had understood from an early age that the job required the suppression of whatever was personal in favor of whatever was institutional, and who had made that choice so thoroughly and so long ago that it no longer felt like suppression. It felt like who she was. What Anne had said in the private conversation that would eventually, through the slow, indirect channels by which palace decisions always become known, become the basis for what the press would call the final decision, was something like this. The family had been operating for years on the assumption that the situation with Harry was temporary, that it was a crisis with a resolution somewhere ahead of it, and that assumption had been wrong. The situation was not temporary. It was not a crisis with a resolution. It was a new reality, and the family's continued failure to treat it as such was causing harm that could be quantified, in the ongoing media cycles it fed, in the instability it created for the institution's planning, in the very real emotional cost it imposed on the people directly involved. The compassionate thing, and the practical thing, and the right thing was to name the reality clearly and then act accordingly. The naming had happened, not in a press release, not in a formal announcement, but in the internal conversations that translated into policy, into planning, into the quiet administrative decisions that determined how the institution functioned day to day. Harry's name had been removed from certain considerations. Certain events had been planned definitively without him. Certain conversations about the future of the monarchy, conversations about roles and responsibilities, and the way the institution would present itself to the public over the coming decades, had been conducted in a way that made clear he was not part of those plans, not excluded in a punitive sense, simply absent from them, the way you are absent from plans that are simply not yours. For William, the hardest part of all of this was not the decision itself. The decision, by the time he arrived at it, had felt almost inevitable, the product of years of painful evidence that had accumulated slowly enough that each individual piece could be explained away, but which, taken together, added up to something undeniable. The hardest part was what the decision meant about his relationship with his brother, not the public relationship, which had long since become a kind of performance of normalcy that neither of them could fully maintain, but the private one. The one that existed in the memory of two boys who had grown up together in circumstances that nobody else could fully understand, who had walked behind their mother's coffin together when they were 15 and 12 years old, and who had, in some way, never entirely stopped walking beside each other in that sense, side by side through something that was too big and too painful to face alone. That relationship had not been destroyed by any single event. It had eroded, the way most things erode, slowly, through the accumulation of small frictions that individually seem manageable but collectively wear something down to the point where it no longer has the strength it once had. The arguments over Meghan. The arguments over Harry's treatment by the press. The argument, reportedly fierce, reportedly physical at one point, that had happened at Nottingham Cottage, and had been described in Harry's memoir in terms that William had not publicly confirmed or denied, but that had clearly landed as a wound. By the time of the final decision, the brothers had not spoken in months, not because of a specific falling out, just because the space between them had grown so large that neither knew quite how to cross it anymore. What made the situation particularly painful and particularly complex was that both of them were, in their own ways, right. Harry was right that the institution had failed him in specific ways, that the press treatment he and Meghan had received had been different in kind as well as degree from the treatment other members of the family had received, and that the family's response to that treatment had been inadequate. He was right that his mental health had suffered in ways that were serious and real. He was right that Meghan had been subjected to a level of hostility that went beyond normal press scrutiny and into something uglier. He was right about all of that, and his decision to leave had been, in the most basic sense, the decision of a man trying to protect his family from something that was genuinely harming them. And William was right that the way Harry had handled the departure, the interviews, the book, the public airing of specific private moments, had caused damage to the institution that went beyond what could be justified by the genuine grievances that motivated it. He was right that there were ways to leave that did not require setting fire to everything behind you. He was right that the children who would grow up inside this institution after Harry was gone would be affected by the precedent that had been set. He was right that some things, once said publicly, cannot be unsaid, and that the institution he was going to lead had been made harder to lead by the specific nature of what had been said. Two people can both be right and still be unable to find their way back to each other. That was what had happened here, not a simple story of hero and villain, not a clean narrative of victim and perpetrator. A more complicated, more human story of two people who had loved each other and who had also, through a combination of their own choices and the choices of everyone around them, arrived at a place where that love was no longer sufficient to bridge the distance between them. It happened in ordinary families every day. It happened in royal ones too, apparently for all the same reasons. The public watching from outside would continue to search for the simple version. They would continue to assign blame to Harry, to Meghan, to William, to the institution, to the press, to the courtiers who had mishandled things at critical moments. They would continue to pick sides and defend them with the particular passion that comes from seeing your own family story reflected in someone else's. And none of that was wrong, exactly. It was just incomplete, because the full story of what had happened between Harry and his family was not a story about who was right and who was wrong. It was a story about the limits of love and loyalty in the face of everything that makes those things difficult, the weight of expectation, the pain of feeling unseen, the impossible task of being both a person and a symbol at the same time, and the way that task, when it fails, can take everything down with it. The decision that Anne and William had arrived at was, in the end, not really about Harry at all. It was about the institution. It was about the judgment made carefully, made painfully, made with full awareness of what it cost, that the institution's future could no longer be held hostage to the hope of a reconciliation that showed no signs of being possible. The hope had been good. The hope had been necessary. But the hope had also been a kind of paralysis, and the paralysis had gone on long enough. It was time, finally, to let go of it. To stop planning for a future in which Harry came back, and to start planning for the future that actually existed. That future was already taking shape. William and Catherine were doing the work, showing up, fulfilling engagements, representing the institution in the way that the institution needed to be represented. The children, George, Charlotte, Louis, were growing up with an understanding of their roles that was more deliberate and more considered than the understanding that had been given to William and Harry, shaped by the hard lessons of what had gone wrong with the previous generation. The monarchy was changing, slowly and carefully, in ways that were designed to make it sustainable rather than spectacular. And the space that Harry had once occupied within it, the space of the younger, freer, more relatable royal, was being quietly, permanently closed. The news, when it finally began to surface publicly, came the way all important royal news comes sideways, not through an official announcement, not through a press conference or a statement from Buckingham Palace, but through a series of small, seemingly unrelated developments that journalists and royal watchers began to piece together in the days and weeks after the private decisions had already been made. A detail here, a source there, a comment that seemed innocuous until you placed it next to 3 other comments that had been made in similar language over a similar period of time. And then the shape of it became visible, even before anyone had put it into words. The first thing people noticed was the absence. Not the kind of absence that generates immediate alarm, not the absence of Harry at a specific event where he would obviously have been expected, but a quieter kind of absence. The absence of his name from the language that palace officials and royal correspondents used when discussing the future of the monarchy. He had for years been referenced in these conversations, obliquely, carefully, but referenced nonetheless, as someone whose situation remained open, whose role remained undefined, whose relationship with the institution was evolving rather than concluded. And then, gradually, that referencing stopped. Not dramatically. Not with any single moment that could be pointed to and said, "There, that is when it changed." Just a slow fading, like a signal growing weaker the further you move from its source. Royal correspondents, the people who had spent careers learning to read the spaces between official statements, picked up on it before the broader public did. They had sources, the careful kind who never said anything directly but who knew how to indicate, through what they did not say, what was actually happening. And what was indicated, through these careful non-saying conversations, was that something had shifted. That the ongoing question of Harry's status, the question that had been answered differently in different contexts over the past several years, had been settled, not in a way that would be formally announced, not in a way that required any public acknowledgement from Harry or from the family, but settled in the way that matters, in the internal planning documents, in the institutional arrangements, in the private understanding of the people who ran the machinery of the monarchy day to day. The phrase, "their return is over," appeared first in a British tabloid, attributed to a source close to the royal family. It was dramatic language, tabloid language, designed to generate the maximum number of clicks. But underneath the drama, the people who understood the situation recognized it as accurate in its essentials. Whatever had been left open, whatever possibility had been maintained, however implicitly, that Harry and Meghan might eventually find their way back into some version of a working relationship with the institution, that possibility had closed. The tabloid word for it was exile. The palace word for it, to the extent that the palace had a word for it, was something more like resolution. But the practical reality was the same. Harry and Meghan were outside the institution, and they would remain outside it, and everyone who needed to act on that understanding was now acting on it. In California, life went on. Harry and Meghan had projects. They had commitments. They had, in the years since their departure, built a life that did not depend on their royal connections in the way that their early plans had perhaps assumed it would. The Netflix deal had not been what they hoped. The Spotify deal had ended badly. Various initiatives had been launched with great fanfare and had then quietly receded. But they had also found things that worked, causes that were genuine to them, work that felt meaningful, a life in Montecito that was, by almost any objective standard, extraordinarily comfortable even if it was smaller than the global platform they had once imagined. They were raising their children. They were making things. They were living, in the most basic sense, the life they had chosen. Whether they knew the specifics of what had been decided inside the family was unclear. Harry had enough sources of his own, enough people who remained in contact with him from his former life, that it was difficult to imagine he was entirely unaware that something had shifted. But knowing and accepting are different things, and whatever Harry knew or suspected, he had not, at the point when this story was becoming public, spoken about it publicly in terms that acknowledged the finality of what had happened. Perhaps because he did not yet fully accept it. Perhaps because accepting it would require a kind of grief that he was not yet ready for. Or perhaps because, in some way that was entirely human and understandable, he still hoped. Even now. Even after everything. The hope, if it existed, was not irrational. Families have surprised themselves before. Estrangements that seemed permanent have ended. People who seemed irreconcilable have found their way back to something, if not to what they had been before. Harry's own grandfather, Prince Philip, had once been estranged from members of his family in ways that had seemed permanent and had eventually resolved themselves. Not completely, not without leaving marks, but resolved enough. The royal family's history was full of these stories, buried under the official narratives of dignity and duty, of real human relationships that had broken and mended and broken again, and somehow, over long enough time, arrived at something livable. But there was a quality to this particular situation that felt different from those historical precedents. What had happened between Harry and his family was not just private. It was not something that had played out in letters and private conversations and the closed rooms of country houses. It had played out in public, in real time, in front of hundreds of millions of people who had formed their own opinions and attached their own feelings to it. And that made it different in a structural sense. Because the reconciliation, if it were ever to happen, would also have to happen in public. Would also have to be performed for the audience that had watched the estrangement. And the performing of it, the management of what it would mean and how it would be understood, was a problem that neither side seemed to have a clear answer to, even in the hypothetical. The institution had made its peace with the absence. That was what the private conversations of recent weeks had amounted to, not a punishment, not a rejection in any emotionally simple sense, but a kind of institutional reckoning with reality. The monarchy would not be defined by the absence of Harry. It would simply function without him, as it had begun to do already, and as it would continue to do in the future. The work of representation, of continuity, of being the symbol that the country needed its royal family to be, that work was being done by the people who had chosen to do it. And the people who had chosen to do it were getting on with the doing. Princess Anne, more than almost anyone, embodied that approach. She had spent over 50 years in service to an institution that had not always made service easy. She had watched it change around her, had watched the expectations of what a royal should be evolve with each generation, and had continued to show up at agricultural shows and military ceremonies and hospital openings and the 1,000 other events that made up the working life of a senior royal, with the consistency of someone who had decided long ago that the showing up was the point. Not the glamour, not the attention, not the moment of being seen, the showing up, the continuity. The proof, offered quietly and repeatedly over decades, that the institution existed for something beyond the people within it. Her view of Harry was not cruel, it was not dismissive. It was the view of a woman who understood, from the inside, what the job required, and who had watched someone find that they could not do it, and who had drawn the only conclusion available to someone with her clarity of mind and her depth of experience, that the person who could not do the job should not be made to do it, and that the institution should not exhaust itself trying to make space for someone who had already made their choice. There was no malice in it. There was almost no emotion in it at all, in the way that the deepest institutional thinking tends to operate beyond the reach of ordinary emotion. It was simply a clear-eyed acknowledgement of what was true. William, in the weeks after the private conversations had concluded and the institutional adjustments had begun, had been seen at a series of public engagements that were notable for a particular quality of focus. He had always been capable of this kind of focus, of being genuinely present at the events he attended, of making the person in front of him feel that they had his full attention, of turning the abstract machinery of royal representation into something that felt real and human. But there was something in the way he carried himself in this period that suggested a settling, a sense of a man who had made a difficult decision and had arrived on the other side of it at something like peace. Not happiness exactly. The situation was not one that admitted of happiness, but peace. The peace of having done what needed to be done, and then continuing to show up for the things that needed showing up for. Catherine had been beside him, as she almost always was at public engagements, and her own presence had a quality that matched his in these weeks. The quality of someone who understood the weight of what her husband was carrying and who had chosen, deliberately and without drama, to make that weight easier for him by sharing it. Their partnership had always been one of the things that people admired most about them, even people who were critical of the monarchy in general. This sense of two people who had genuinely chosen each other, and who had built something real inside the extraordinary circumstances of their lives. In the weeks when the finality of the Harry situation was settling into place, that partnership was more visible than ever. A kind of anchor, a kind of proof that things could hold even when other things fell apart. What the public made of all of this depended entirely on what the public had already believed going in. Those who had been sympathetic to Harry and Meghan saw the decision as a confirmation of their worst fears, that the institution was rigid and unforgiving, that it had never really wanted Harry back, that the language of open doors had always been cover for a closed heart. Those who had been critical of Harry and Meghan saw it as an overdue recognition of reality, as evidence that the institution had finally found the strength to stop being held hostage by the threat of ongoing bad publicity. Both readings were partial. Both readings were, in the way of partial readings, also true enough to be defensible. The fuller truth was harder to hold. It required sitting with the reality that everyone involved had acted in ways that were understandable given who they were, and that those understandable actions had produced an outcome that nobody had wanted, but that everyone had, in some sense, brought about together. It required acknowledging that the institution was both worth preserving and genuinely capable of harm. That love between family members is real even when the consequences of that love's failure are real. That some situations do not resolve into clarity about who was right. They resolve, instead, into the simple fact of what happened, which is often neither as clean nor as satisfying as a verdict. What happened was this. A family that had tried for several years to find a way to hold together across a fracture that proved too deep to bridge had finally stopped trying. Not with anger, not with a final confrontation or a dramatic scene, but with the quiet, costly, adult decision that some things are genuinely over. That honoring what is real sometimes requires releasing what you wished were real. That the door, however long it has been left open, can eventually, with care, with grief, with the full weight of everything it means, be closed. The monarchy would continue. It had continued through worse. The story of Harry and the family would continue to be told in books and documentaries and the endless recycling of the internet long after the immediate moment had passed. And Harry and Meghan would continue their lives in California, raising their children, doing their work, living the version of freedom they had chosen with all the costs that version of freedom had turned out to carry. None of it was a clean ending. Life rarely is. But something had ended, something real and specific, and for everyone involved, deeply felt. The chapter that had begun with hope, with the genuine possibility that this might resolve into something better than what it had become, had closed. And the people who had closed it would carry the weight of that for the rest of their lives, the way you carry every significant loss. Not as something that goes away, but as something you learn, slowly and imperfectly, to carry without being crushed by it.